Forget fairy tales, forget the chivalry, and definitely forget the idea that medieval Europe was some enchanted land of knights rescuing maidens in distress. If you were a woman living in those centuries, rescue was the last thing you'd expect. Because when it came to punishment, the system didn't just throw the book at you, it turned your body into the book. Today we're diving headfirst into the most grotesque, bizarre, and flat-out unbelievable punishments women faced in medieval Europe. And trust me, this isn't the kind of history lesson you got in school. Let's begin with one of the most infamous devices ever created, the scolds bridle. Imagine being forced to wear a heavy iron cage that locked around your head like some deranged medieval helmet. But this wasn't just a fashion statement from hell. Inside the mask was a flat piece of iron that shoved into your mouth, pinning your tongue down. The idea was simple. If you were a scold, basically a woman accused of talking too much, nagging her husband, or publicly criticizing authority, the bridle silenced you. And medieval authorities didn't stop at silencing. Many of these bridles had bells attached, so as you stumbled through town, everyone heard the clanging announcement of your shame. It turned humiliation into street theater. And the cruelest twist, people were encouraged to mock and jeer at the victim while she was paraded around. So if you've ever complained about Twitter mobs, at least your punishment wasn't a 20-pound iron muzzle with a tongue-piercing spoon attached. But let's not stop there, because medieval Europe had an entire toolbox of creative cruelty. Take the ducking stool. This one was basically medieval waterboarding, except instead of secret prisons, it was done right in the village square. The setup was simple: a wooden chair mounted on a long beam, placed beside a pond or river. The unlucky woman, usually accused of being a witch, a gossip, or just too outspoken, was strapped into the chair. Then the whole contraption was swung out over the water and dunked again and again. Sometimes it was for public amusement, other times it was framed as a test. If you drowned, congratulations, you were innocent. If you survived, bad news clearly, you were guilty of witchcraft, and worse punishments awaited. That's medieval logic for you. A lose-lose situation dressed up as justice. Now you might be wondering, why so many punishments targeted women accused of talking too much or stepping out of line socially? The short answer: patriarchy on steroids. Medieval society was obsessed with enforcing obedience, and women who dared to speak loudly or challenge authority were seen as threats. And instead of letting you off with a fine or a slap on the wrist, they engineered punishments that were equal parts physical torture, public humiliation, and community entertainment. Imagine Netflix binge watching, but the show was your neighbor strapped to a chair being dunked until unconscious. And speaking of humiliation, let's talk about the cucking stool, the twisted cousin of the ducking stool. Unlike its watery relative, this punishment didn't require a river. Instead, women were strapped into a chair mounted on wheels and paraded through town, while crowds hurled insults, garbage, and sometimes stones. If you were really unlucky, the procession ended at a dung heap where the stool was tipped over, dumping you into filth. And the crimes? Same old story: nagging your husband, quarreling in public, or heaven forbid, refusing to stay quiet. Because apparently, medieval men thought the best way to solve marital arguments was to turn them into community carnivals of degradation. But not every punishment was about dunking or dragging. Some were downright surgical. Let's take the case of women accused of adultery. In certain regions of medieval Europe, the punishment wasn't just a fine or divorce, it was mutilation. Cutting off noses, ears, or even branding foreheads wasn't uncommon. Why? Because disfigurement turned the body itself into a permanent criminal record. A scarred face broadcast your supposed crime to everyone, forever. Forget mugshots. Your punishment was your face. And here's where it gets darker. Husbands sometimes had the right to carry out these mutilations themselves, especially in cases of adultery. Imagine living in a world where marital disputes could legally end with your nose on the chopping block. Romantic dinners must have been awkward. And if you thought medieval Europe limited its creativity to physical mutilation, allow me to introduce you to the torture of shoes. In some towns, women accused of sexual misconduct or stepping outside prescribed roles were forced to wear iron shoes heated over fire. Yes, you heard that right. Red-hot shoes. They'd strap them on and make the victim walk. It was both a spectacle and a punishment, a fiery walk of shame that left permanent damage. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. You strayed from the path, now you'll burn while trying to walk it. It's the kind of punishment that sounds too cinematic to be real, and yet it was documented in records across Europe. Of course, medieval authorities didn't stop at individual punishments. They knew how to turn entire communities against women through rituals of collective humiliation. Enter the charivari. This wasn't a device but a practice, a public shaming parade often aimed at women who failed in their roles. Maybe she married a much younger man. Maybe she was suspected of infidelity, or maybe she was simply considered domineering. The punishment: a mob of neighbors would gather outside her home, banging pots and pans, shouting insults, sometimes dragging her out for a mock parade through town. It was chaos, dressed up as morality enforcement. And if you think that sounds a lot like internet trolling, congratulations, the medieval version just added torches and actual mobs. But what about women accused of witchcraft? Surely you've heard the stories of burning at the stake. But here's where the grotesque details come in. Many women weren't immediately burned alive. First came torture designed to extract confessions, and these sessions were brutal. Devices like the thumbscrew crushed fingers joint by joint. The strappado involved hoisting a woman by her arms tied behind her back, and then suddenly dropping her, tearing her shoulders out of their sockets. And for midwives or women suspected of sorcery, there were specialized tortures, like forced insertion of sharp objects or red-hot irons under fingernails. Confessions obtained this way weren't exactly reliable, but that didn't matter. Once accused, the outcome was practically inevitable. And when the fire finally came, it was public theater. Entire towns gathered to watch. Vendors sold food. Children were brought along. It was punishment as entertainment, morality mixed with spectacle. And yet not all punishments were fiery or bloody. Some were disturbingly psychological in their humiliation. One bizarre example was forced cross-dressing. Women accused of stepping outside their proper roles might be paraded through town dressed as men, with fake beards or hats, ridiculed as unnatural. It was intended to erase femininity by mocking it. And though it might sound less violent than iron shoes or mutilation, the social consequences were devastating. In a world where reputation meant survival, being marked as deviant could destroy your entire life. And here's a particularly grotesque twist that most people don't hear about: forced feeding of foul substances. In some cases, women accused of lying, gossiping, or sexual misconduct were punished by being forced to swallow nauseating concoctions, spoiled food, animal excrement, or filthy water. It wasn't just torture of the body, but degradation of the soul. Imagine being dragged before your neighbors and made to ingest garbage while everyone watched. That wasn't punishment for a crime. That was punishment for existing outside control. Now, if all of this sounds like society was simply trying to keep women in their place, that's because it was, but with layers of cruelty that went far beyond what we usually imagine. Take, for instance, the wheel punishment. Most people associate the breaking wheel with executions of thieves or rebels, but for women it had its own twisted variation. Instead of instantly breaking bones to kill, women were sometimes bound to smaller wheels and left exposed in marketplaces. Passers-by were encouraged to spit, mock, and even throw refuse. In some accounts, women were tied spread-eagled across the wheel, as if displayed like an exhibit of shame, not just a criminal. The wheel wasn't always about death. Sometimes it was about dragging out humiliation, letting the punishment linger for hours before authorities finally decided whether execution would follow. It was part torture device, part billboard. And let's not forget the punishments tied to accusations of poisoning. Medieval Europe was obsessed with the idea that women, especially wives, might secretly poison food. Why? Because in most households, women managed the kitchen. That meant they had the power to season meals or slip something deadly into them. If accused, the punishments were gruesome. In Germanic towns, women suspected of poisoning might be boiled alive. Yes, an enormous cauldron, bubbling water, and the accused was tossed in. In France, some were forced to drink trial potions mixed with filth and herbs until they collapsed. And here's where it gets truly grotesque. In certain towns, if a woman was convicted, she was tied inside a sack with snakes or animals and thrown into a river. Death by drowning wasn't enough. It had to come with the sensation of being trapped with writhing creatures. Medieval justice had a flair for the theatrical. Speaking of rivers, water itself became a favorite stage for punishment. Women accused of witchcraft or consorting with the devil were subjected to ordeals by water. Tied hand and foot, they were tossed into rivers or lakes. If they floated, guilty. If they sank, innocent but dead. This wasn't limited to witches either. Sometimes women accused of adultery or theft faced similar tests. The symbolism was twisted. Water, considered pure, would reject the guilty, while the innocent would be accepted and sink. Of course, survival was nearly impossible either way. And the cruelest irony: if a woman floated, the crowd saw proof of her guilt. If she drowned, she had already lost the only life she had. It was medieval justice's ultimate catch-22. Now let's turn to one punishment that was as ridiculous as it was cruel: the pillory and stocks. You've probably seen the image of someone with their head and hands locked in a wooden frame, left out for public ridicule. But what isn't often told is how women were subjected to gendered twists of this punishment. A woman locked in stocks might have her hair shaved off first, a devastating symbol in a society where long hair represented beauty and femininity. She might have offensive symbols hung around her neck, like wooden carvings of animals associated with lust or betrayal. Sometimes baskets of dung were dumped over her head, while children threw stones. And remember, this wasn't over in an hour. Women could be left for entire days, forced to endure weather, thirst, and the endless jeers of neighbors. The punishment wasn't just physical discomfort. It was the permanent destruction of social standing, because once your face had been shoved through a pillory in public, everyone knew you not as a wife, mother, or neighbor, but as a spectacle of disgrace. And then there's the whipping post. Sounds straightforward, right? But for women, it carried a double sting: physical pain and moral condemnation. Women accused of prostitution, adultery, or even petty theft were stripped to the waist and whipped in public squares. The number of lashes varied, but the real punishment was being exposed to everyone's eyes. In some towns, officials made sure the lashes drew blood, then rubbed salt into the wounds to prevent infection, or perhaps just to increase agony. In others, the woman was whipped while being paraded from one end of town to the other, ensuring maximum humiliation. Imagine the horror of being punished, not just with pain, but with the gaze of every neighbor, every child, every elder, each one storing away the memory of your humiliation forever. But medieval punishments didn't stop at the body. They targeted identity itself. Consider shaving as a punishment. It might not sound severe, but in the Middle Ages, a woman's hair was considered her crowning glory, a marker of status and virtue. Shaving it all off was symbolic castration, stripping her of femininity and reducing her to ridicule. In some cases, shaved women were forced to wear crowns made of straw or donkey ears to exaggerate the mockery. And if you think the punishment ended after the shave, think again. Regrowing hair took years, and during that time, the woman's disgrace was on full display. We should also mention the infamous branking stools used in some towns. Women convicted of being disorderly were forced to sit in public on a high stool, sometimes in the middle of marketplaces, wearing placards around their neck, describing their alleged crimes. Imagine being forced to sit for hours while strangers pointed, laughed, and hurled abuse. Unlike imprisonment, this punishment left you vulnerable and exposed, with no chance to hide. It wasn't about correction, it was about erasure, making you into a living example of what not to be. And if you're wondering whether all of these punishments were just about minor crimes, let's step into the grim world of execution rituals, specifically tailored for women. Unlike men, who were often hanged or beheaded, women convicted of serious crimes like infanticide or treason often faced burning alive. Why burning? Because it erased the body. Hanging left corpses on display. Beheading created relics. But burning, it was total annihilation, thought to cleanse society of the offender's impurity. In England, women convicted of high treason were sentenced to be burned at the stake well into the 18th century. In Germany, women accused of child murder were buried alive inside barrels filled with spikes. The logic was horrifying. The punishment had to be as symbolic as it was brutal. And let's not forget about forced marriages as punishment. It might not sound grotesque compared to burning or mutilation, but in practice, it was a life sentence of suffering. In some regions, women convicted of sexual misbehavior could be forced to marry their accuser or another man chosen by authorities. Imagine your punishment for alleged immorality was lifelong bondage to someone you didn't choose, possibly someone abusive. The marriage itself became a prison, and unlike stocks or ducking stools, this punishment didn't last for a day, it lasted until death. Of course, many of these punishments relied on turning the community itself into an instrument of torture. That's the thread that ties them together, the theater of shame. Whether it was bells attached to iron bridles, mobs with pots and pans, or jeering crowds at the stocks, medieval punishments made women's suffering into collective entertainment. And it's this element, the audience, that gave the punishments their staying power, because nothing spreads faster than scandal, and nothing bonds a community like shared cruelty. One of the punishments that blurred the line between spectacle and cruelty was parading with symbols of sin. A woman accused of prostitution, infidelity, or even drunkenness might be forced to walk through the streets carrying objects that marked her crime. For example, in parts of Italy, women labeled adulterers were made to carry a wooden rooster, the universal symbol of lust. In some German towns, prostitutes were forced to wear wreaths of nettles on their heads, the stinging pain serving as both a physical reminder and public shaming. And if you think that sounds almost theatrical, that's because it was. Punishments became a stage play, where props, costumes, and audience participation blended into one grotesque show. Everyone watching understood the message, step out of line, and tomorrow it could be you paraded with nettles digging into your scalp. But medieval justice wasn't just cruel, it was often terrifyingly inventive. Take the ordeal of the hot iron. In some trials, particularly for women accused of theft or sacrilege, the accused had to carry a red-hot iron bar a set number of steps. Afterward, her hands were bandaged, and 3 days later, the bandages were removed. If the wounds were healing cleanly, she was innocent. If they festered, she was guilty. Now, anyone with a basic grasp of infection knows festering was practically guaranteed. But for medieval courts, the judgment of God was all the proof they needed. Imagine standing barefoot in a marketplace, hands blistered, the whole town watching as priests inspected your wounds like they were reading a divine text. The pain was horrific, but the suspense of waiting to see how your body would testify might have been worse. And here's a punishment that targeted not only women's bodies but their roles as mothers: infanticide trials. In many regions, if a woman was suspected of killing her newborn, sometimes because the child was illegitimate, sometimes because the baby died of natural causes, the punishments were extraordinarily harsh. Women found guilty could be buried alive, often with symbolic items placed around them. In some towns, they were drowned in barrels, the water meant to symbolize both baptism and damnation. The symbolism was layered and cruel. The mother who had failed in her sacred role was punished with the very elements of life she was accused of denying her child. This wasn't just justice, it was morality turned into ritual execution. And speaking of ritual, let's talk about public penance ceremonies. Not every punishment involved blood or fire. Sometimes humiliation itself was the weapon. A woman accused of adultery or dishonor might be forced to walk barefoot through town, wearing only a shift, holding a candle, while reciting prayers aloud. In some cases, she was made to kneel at the church doors for hours, confessing her sins in front of everyone arriving for Mass. It was punishment turned into performance, where repentance wasn't a private matter between sinner and God, but a stage play for the entire community. And unlike torture devices, this form of punishment attacked something equally precious: dignity. Now, let's pause for a moment and look at how punishment is often intertwined with class. Because if you were poor, the grotesque became even more grotesque. A noble woman might face house arrest, fines, or religious penance. A peasant woman, she could be whipped, mutilated, or killed. For example, in England, noble women accused of treason were technically sentenced to be burned at the stake. But many were quietly beheaded instead, a quicker and more honorable death. Peasant women, on the other hand, burned publicly, their bodies consumed in front of crowds. Class didn't just decide your lifestyle, it decided how much agony you were allowed at the end. But even in smaller matters, punishments could be shockingly brutal. Consider banishment. On the surface, it sounds mild compared to mutilation or burning, but in the medieval world, exile was often a death sentence. A woman cast out of her community had no legal protection, no family ties, and no access to food or shelter. Bandits, starvation, and exposure claimed many exiles long before they found another settlement willing to take them in. And often, banishment wasn't clean. Women might be whipped or branded before being driven out, ensuring that wherever they went, their disgrace followed. And if you think branding was rare, think again. Women accused of theft might be burned with hot irons, often marked on the face or hands with symbols that identified their crime. A thief might bear the letter. A prostitute could be marked with a symbol of a chalice or cross to imply sin. Imagine carrying those scars for the rest of your life. Every handshake, every encounter revealing your punishment. It was a mark you couldn't escape, a punishment that walked with you long after the public shaming was done. One of the strangest and most grotesque punishments comes from records of forced feeding of salt and bread. In some towns, women accused of minor theft or gossiping were locked up and given nothing but salt-dried bread to eat, with no water to drink. The punishment wasn't about nourishment. It was about thirst, an unbearable, gnawing torment. Days of salt with no relief left the body racked with pain. It was starvation mixed with slow dehydration, and many didn't survive it. Again, punishment wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Bread was the food of life, salt was the food of preservation. Denying water turned those blessings into instruments of cruelty, and medieval society never shied away from spectacle. In some regions of France and Germany, there's a record of women accused of sexual misconduct being tied to millstones and rolled through town, not always to death, but often to severe injury. Why millstones? Because they were heavy, circular, and connected to fertility and grain, the basic sustenance of society. The symbolism was as blunt as the stone itself. If you dishonored the community, the tools of its survival would crush you. By now you can see a pattern. Punishments weren't random. They were deeply symbolic, designed not only to hurt the body, but to send a message to everyone watching. The iron bridle punished speech. The ducking stool punished defiance. The shaved head punished femininity. The burned body punished betrayal. Each punishment wasn't just an act. It was a language, spoken in pain, in fire, in scars, and the whole community was expected to read it. But perhaps the darkest punishments were the ones that blurred the line between religious devotion and physical torment. Women accused of blasphemy or sacrilege were sometimes forced to undergo pilgrimages of penance. Sounds holy, right? Except these weren't serene journeys to shrines. These were forced marches barefoot across miles of terrain, sometimes with iron weights chained to ankles. Women might be ordered to crawl to a holy site on their knees, bleeding across rocky roads, watched by villagers who ensured no shortcuts were taken. Faith and punishment merged into one grotesque ordeal, where salvation was bought with blood and torn flesh. By now you've seen how medieval punishments blended theater, religion and cruelty into one nightmarish system. But some of the most grotesque cases were reserved for crimes that society considered the ultimate betrayal, treason and heresy. For men, this often meant execution by hanging, drawing or beheading. For women it was different. Burning alive was the favored punishment, because it was seen as a way to destroy not only the body, but the memory of treachery. Women's bodies, after all, were considered sacred vessels for life, so destroying them in fire was symbolic erasure. Joan of Arc's execution in 1431 is one of the most famous examples. She wasn't just killed, she was turned into a spectacle. And though she became a saint centuries later, in her own time, she was an example of how brutally the system dealt with women who defied it. Yet not every punishment was about fire or iron. Some punishments were disturbingly domestic. In certain parts of Europe, women accused of quarreling or disobedience could be forced into the bridal cart ritual. A cart decorated with mock symbols of marriage, ribbons, false crowns, and wooden dowries would be pulled through town with the accused woman inside, sometimes with live animals tethered to her. The message was sharp. A woman who dishonored marriage would be mocked by the very institution she betrayed. Crowds gathered not just to gawk but to participate, throwing food, mud, or worse. Imagine being trapped in that rolling prison while your neighbors turned your life into a traveling circus. And let's not forget punishments designed to reach into the household. Husbands sometimes sought justice through courts when their wives were rebellious. The courts didn't just allow it, they facilitated punishments like forced fasting, where a woman would be locked in her home with only bread and water until she learned obedience. In harsher cases, women were legally permitted to be beaten by their husbands with moderate force. But what moderate meant was left dangerously open-ended. The line between lawful discipline and outright torture blurred until women's bodies bore the marks of justice hidden behind closed doors. And if you thought medieval Europe couldn't get more grotesque, allow me to introduce the sack punishment. In certain towns, women convicted of infanticide were sewn into sacks with animals, cats, snakes, even dogs, and thrown into rivers. The logic? Each animal represented aspects of the crime or spiritual forces of punishment. The cats scratched, the snakes bit, the dogs clawed. Death came not just from drowning, but from chaos inside the sack itself. This wasn't just a death sentence, it was a deliberate spectacle of horror. And it was specific to women, because the act of killing a child was seen as the most unnatural crime of all. But sometimes punishment wasn't immediate. Sometimes it was about dragging out humiliation for years. Women found guilty of adultery in certain Italian cities could be forced to wear special clothing that marked them permanently. Bright yellow veils, striped cloaks, or emblems sewn into garments became daily reminders of disgrace. Unlike stocks or whippings, which ended after hours or days, these punishments clung for life. You couldn't hide, you couldn't move towns without explanation, and you couldn't escape the stares. Every morning when you dressed, you were re-punished. And in some regions, punishments crossed into the bizarre. In parts of Germany, women accused of gossiping were forced to wear shame masks, grotesque iron masks, shaped like pigs, donkeys, or demons. The masks had exaggerated noses, horns, or tongues, mocking the supposed sin of the wearer. Some even had spikes inside, cutting the face if you moved too much. Women marched in these masks through markets, while children followed behind, laughing and pointing. It was torture disguised as carnival, cruelty disguised as comedy. Let's also remember that medieval justice wasn't always consistent. Two women could commit the same act in different towns and receive wildly different punishments. One might pay a fine, another might lose an ear, another might burn. Justice wasn't blind, it was local, shaped by custom, superstition, and the mood of whoever sat in judgment. This inconsistency only deepened the terror, because no one knew what fate awaited them if accused, and that uncertainty was a punishment in itself. Now you might be asking, did anyone resist these grotesque punishments? Surprisingly, yes. Records show communities sometimes protested the harsh treatment of women, especially if the accused came from respected families. In some cases, women's relatives staged escapes or bribed guards to prevent execution, and there are accounts of towns quietly refusing to enforce extreme sentences, instead letting women slip away. But for the majority, the poor, the vulnerable, the socially powerless, there was no such mercy. And here's the haunting truth. Many punishments weren't just about the woman herself, they were about the audience. Every ducking stool, every bridle, every burning was staged to remind others what could happen if they broke the rules. Women's bodies became living billboards of obedience. Pain was only half the punishment. The other half was the gaze, the eyes of neighbors, priests, officials, and children all watching. And once you've been paraded through town in iron shoes or shaved bald before the church doors, you could never step back into ordinary life again. It's easy, centuries later, to laugh at the absurdity of masks shaped like pigs or trials by hot iron. But underneath the grotesque was something far darker, a society that needed women's obedience so badly, it turned punishment into art. Every bridle, every dunking, every public shaving was a brushstroke in a masterpiece of control, and the audience wasn't just entertained, they were complicit. By laughing, jeering, or even simply watching, communities gave power to the cruelty. And maybe that's the most disturbing lesson of all, because while iron bridles and ducking stools are relics of the past, the idea of turning humiliation into public theater hasn't gone away. The tools may have changed, no more stocks in the village square, but plenty of public shaming online, yet the mechanism feels familiar. Pain as spectacle, disgrace as entertainment, punishment as performance. The medieval world may have had iron masks and burning stakes, but we still know how to make a show out of someone else's suffering. So the next time you picture the Middle Ages, don't just imagine knights' castles or stained glass cathedrals. Remember the women locked in masks, shaped like demons, paraded in carts, or strapped into chairs and dunked until their lungs filled with water. Remember the grotesque punishments that turned their bodies into lessons. And maybe, just maybe, ask yourself how much of that impulse, to control, to humiliate, to punish publicly, still lingers today, hidden in different forms.